Hello, hello. We are back with Work at Life. I am Maddie Grant. I'm a culture designer at PROPEL, and I'm here as always with Sonia Lucina from Question Pro, and I'll turn it over to Sonia in a second. But just a quick recap about Work at Life. We talk about the gray area between work and life, haha. But what is actually really important about this gray area is that in these turbulent times, it's really blending more and more and more and more, of course, related to the pandemic. But not only that, just in the way that organizations and employees both on both sides are really trying to understand how to be more fulfilled in the workplace, and organizations, the good ones, how to really help their employees be successful, and so that everybody can do better work ultimately, which is what we want. And so we're all very passionate about this topic. And this season two, we're tackling a very big issue, which is the first female recession. So we've been talking about several different kind of subtopics under that. But this time, today, we have a super special guest again. Very exciting to talk about this topic. And for once, it's not super depressing. So, so Sonia, why don't you introduce yourself, and then we'll ask Dan to introduce himself.
Yeah, thank you, Maddie. So I'm Sonia Lucina. I'm an organizational psychologist. I'm the president of the workforce business unit at Question Pro. And like Maddie was saying, just somebody who's a huge proponent of making organizations have incredible cultures, making people happy and fulfilled with their work. And a big part of the reason why we chose season 2 to combat the first female recession is as a female that's been in the business world for a long time and worked with many people who I respect tremendously, this was something that was also really personal to me. I think it's a huge deal for organizations, and a really incredible moment where even though women have been hit so hard and harder than a lot of other groups, for all of us on this podcast today, I think we identify ourselves as eternal optimists. And so in our discussion, we were talking about, how do we turn this around? How do we take this pandemic that's, I mean, nothing short of a tragedy for many people, and get something really good out of it? And so one of the really good things that I've gotten out of it so far is actually meeting Dan. So we were at a conference together virtually, and I heard him and his brother Patrick speak, and I thought, oh, I've got to get to know these guys. I mean, just the way they talked about changing the world, the way they talked about the whole person experience and how they envisioned things could be different. I thought, I need to be a part of that. I need to be a part of their world and part of this movement. And so was really, really happy when Dan accepted our invitation to join the podcast. And I will let him introduce himself, but he is probably one of the most interesting, incredible people that I've met. So I don't even know, Dan, if we'll have enough time for all of your introduction and all the fun and great things that you have done. But it's just so great to, again, I've enjoyed our conversation so much on so many different topics, but particularly when we talked about leadership, particularly when we talked about and did some of the research around, who's expected to be a leader, what can be different. And so please take a few minutes to introduce yourself. But thank you so much again for sharing this space with us and then coming on the chat.
Thank you, Sonia and Maddie. It's my pleasure. Let's see, which persona should I introduce? Which version of myself today? No, I'm honored to be here, and I had the same feeling towards you, Sonia. Meeting you, it was inspiring. I love talking to self-proclaimed optimists like myself, and I always joke, being an optimist is actually, many people think, well, it's easy. When you're an optimist, you're just, everything's good. And I'm like, well, actually not. When you're an optimist, you have to find the good in everything, even the things that are difficult.
Yeah.
And that can take a lot of time and a lot of searching and a lot of patience. So I am a self-proclaimed optimist. My personal mission is, I want to inspire people to act on and believe in what inspires them. I mean, that is ultimately what I believe my mission is. And I am the co-founder of RADICL with my brother. My brother and I started RADICL in October of last year. And I'm a sort of a serial entrepreneur, I guess you could call me. And RADICL was formed in an obvious time, and it really started out as a movement of change. And from the pandemic we were living in, to work changing forever from our perspective, to this was post George Floyd being murdered, post the rise of a kind of a new social rights and social activism movement that we believe really strongly in, the political polarity and environment that we live in the US and even throughout the country. There's a lot of work we need to do to bring human beings back together again and ultimately humanize the workplace again. So that's why we founded the company. That's our mission. That's our purpose. We hope to do a little good and be a part of the change in the movement. And being on conversations like this is a part of normalizing conversation, right? Talking about stuff where we have work to do. Our goal is not to solve everything on this call. If we could, we could retire. Our goal is to shine lights on things that we can think about, talk about, and hopefully make a little bit of movement. So thank you for having me on.
Well, we're clearly super aligned on all of those things.
So kicking off, usually what we do in our conversations is we talk about theory, we talk about change, what we want to do, and then we talk about data. And do our theories, do our expectations, do our hypotheses come to life? And so in talking about women leaders, recently I was reading an article in HBR, and it talked about the glass ceiling and all of these different things. And it was a brilliant article, but a lot of what it talked about was really similar challenges that we've experienced over the last decade plus more, many decades. And so our conversation was around, well, how do we help women get in leadership positions better? What can organizations do? What can women do themselves? How do we change this? Because we know the statistics are still sad at best in the disparity of the different genders that hold some of these key roles in organizations of different sizes. And so in our brainstorm leading up to this podcast, we talked about what makes a great leader. What are these characteristics that define a person? And we asked a number of different traits. We asked about, out of the following traits, which ones do you find most important for a leader to embody? And we asked almost 1,000 people across the US, several different times in different orders, and got, these results where the top ones were with integrity, for a person to be strong, decisive, but then patient, empathetic, inspiring, optimistic, authentic. And then some of the little lower scoring ones were caring, flexible, kind, generous, forgiving, and so on. But what really struck us in big part too was just the strong combination of the traits at the beginning. And I know it sparked a lot of discussion amongst us around, well, are we now getting to the tipping point? Are we seeing that there is actually a change in what people would expect out of a leader over, the past many years? And maybe has the pandemic really taught us something around who do we want to be guided by? Who do we want to be developed by? Whose team do we want to be on? So Maddie, Dan, I know we had a lively chat around these numbers. We'd love to hear your opinion around some of the things that really struck you as we were getting this data back and chatting and saying, wait, really? Wow, like this is pretty remarkable.
Yeah, Dan.
Sure. Yeah, I can jump in. So I have a couple of things. I mean, number one, so over the past 16 months, and before I specifically address these numbers, we've seen leaders rise who weren't officially, quote unquote, a leader, right? We've seen the best of leaders. We've also seen the worst of leaders in some cases. But I think the best is what we've all zeroed in on. And the reason is because there was a need for it. It was necessary to take care of each other, right? And when it's necessary to take care of each other, human beings do rise to the occasion for the most part. And so words like being empathetic, inspiring, optimistic, why these have been words in the past, they really started to come to life. I joke the question of how are you doing today became a real important question. It wasn't just a time filler, right? It wasn't just let's wait 16 seconds. I'm going to ask you this just because I need to, and you're going to say I'm doing fine. And we're going to say great, and you're going to get on with the conversation. Now it's how are you? How are you doing today? Like I really want to know, are you okay? And so we got to know each other, and it was easier to be empathetic, right? It was easier to be optimistic because there was an expectation, and then there was a human fundamental need. People needed to have to be more open and be more vulnerable with each other. So with that, now that we're for the most part kind of post-pandemic, my hope is that we hold on to some of these leadership traits that we learned. We always knew they were important, but we learned how important they really were. And I think this data is interesting because I kind of call this the strength sandwich, because what I'm seeing here is that we still want leaders to be strong and decisive. We do want leaders, we don't want leaders to be wishy-washy and say, well, maybe we can do this. Maybe, we want leaders who have a point of view, who have a North Star, who have a purpose, who drive things forward. But it has to be done for the right reasons. Strength for strength reasons is the wrong reasons to be a leader. If you're strong and you're patient, that's a much better set of characteristics. If you're decisive, right, and you're empathetic, these are leaders that we want in front of us. These are leaders that we want leading us. And on the very, very bottom of this, for those who can't see it, we have opinionated, which I think came in at a whopping 5%. We don't want leaders who just shout out opinions simply because they have the title of being leadership, right? We want thoughtful, caring, patient, decisive, and strong leaders who everything they do is built around integrity. So that's the way I read this data, and I was actually really happy to see this data.
Yeah, one of the things that struck out to me is authentic is pretty high up there at 32%. And that, I think, really relates to what you were just saying, Dan, because if a leader is being authentic, what does that mean? That means they're actually sharing their own, humanness, right? They're sharing their own stresses, and they're being vulnerable potentially. They're doing all these things that, like you said, the pandemic has kind of forced us to do. But in that, they're becoming a better leader, actually. Like, I don't actually think that somebody being authentic, I feel like that word, it doesn't really, in the past, has not been associated with leadership necessarily, unless you are, some kind of like gold star of a person. But for your average head of a company or CEO or senior manager, or team leader, like, authenticity doesn't come into the picture. And it's something that I wrote a book in 2011 called Humanize, actually. And authenticity was one of the things that was starting to come to the forefront. And the book was about how social media was changing how we manage and lead our organizations, not just how we communicate with customers. But it was the beginning, back in 2011, the beginning of this whole digital change, this new work environment that started long before the pandemic, of kind of changing how organizations are run or need to be run. They need to be more flexible, more authentic, specifically, more trustworthy, all of these things. But the shift towards individual leaders having some of these traits, I think, has been much slower until now. And it's just happened in a year, or hopefully, based on this data.
Yeah, I think, authenticity is, I completely agree that it's such a key attribute of leadership. And I'm asked often, well, what does authenticity mean? And obviously it's bringing your complete self, your whole self, your authentic self to work, your whole person to work. But it's also, I think being authentic means you have the right to be more vulnerable. And what I mean by that is it's okay for a leader to say, I don't know the answer to this, right? I don't know when we can all come back to the workplace. And that's being authentic, right? It's being vulnerable. And I think, and that's one side of authenticity. The other side is show up as you are, show up as the person you are, whatever that might be. And I think that starts to overlap with inclusion, and all ideas are welcome, all people are welcome, and we all need to be a part of this together. And that's that togetherness and that connectedness that we talk about so often. So without authenticity, we lose so much opportunity, right, to come together, and we lose so much of authenticity, to tie this back to the topic of women in leadership too, right? If we don't support our authentic selves, and we sort of support purely on the definition of what we believe something should be, or what a leadership characteristic should be, but don't allow authenticity into the equation, we lose the opportunity, right, for change, right? Authenticity drives change in so many ways.
Right.
I think back to this in my mind triggers ideas of, back in the day when people would say, oh, I slept only 2 hours, and the glamorizing of I'm always on, or burning the midnight oil, or whatever the, many sayings are around that, and how exhausting it is to show up as someone other than yourself because you feel like you need to embody this specific persona. And I know I was recently doing a presentation around the similar topic. How do we, ignite the rise of the female leader? And with that, I was also reading some research that was based on brain function and neuroscience, and showing in various studies that women often are inherently more empathetic than men. It does not mean that every woman is empathetic. It doesn't by no means mean that every man is not empathetic, but it's just one of those, like when you start to look at specific traits, there are probably more here in a list, like we were saying, there were maybe more stereotypically female, where all of a sudden, hopefully it'll also give women the ability to relax and really show up more as themselves, saying, wow, some of these things that maybe I do embody, but I was too afraid to show it in the workplace, people actually are looking for that. And that's where I think sharing some of this data could be very, very powerful, because it can, not only does it take, like I used to talk about, showing up to work with a mask on, and it didn't matter if you were a leader, if you're an employee, you could have chaos at home. You could be going through the toughest situations, but more often than not, you were expected, as soon as you walk through that door, all of that stays behind you and you're at work. How is that possible? We don't switch off our brain. We're that one person. And I think in here, and when it comes to leadership, it's really embracing that and saying, I am this, or I am, while I am decisive, I may be even more patient, and I can really play up to that strength and show up as that person. And now I know that people will value that. I think that's where sharing this kind of data and this narrative is so powerful, because I think, Dan, you were saying before, like we can't say it enough. Like there are all these things, and I sometimes I think I read articles or I listen to conversations, and it has a similar thread. But I think a lot of times, to really create a movement, things need to be said enough times and in different ways, because they click differently for different people. And people have those aha moments at different times where they say, this is what we can do differently. So that's why I love showing this information, different perspectives, because I'm hoping, maybe some people will have an aha moment during our conversation and be able to bring something different and empower women differently, or women themselves can feel empowered differently as well.
Yeah. So well said. And I think kind of two things to that. Now, number one, I think when we talk about a movement, I think it's so important that we recognize, let me back up. Change happens slowly. The best example I could use is a flower that's blooming. If you sit there and you stare at it, If you can stay up for 3 days and stare at it, you might see it happen. I suppose you might. You probably doze off a little bit. But if you walk away for 2 days and you come back, the flowers actually bloomed considerably. You're like, wow, how did that happen so quickly? So one thing I think we have an opportunity to do, and I think this next slide you're going to show is interesting because it does start to show that maybe we have some mindset that's starting to change, right? And we have to recognize small successes in change movements versus always be on the side where nothing's happening, we're not getting anywhere. Because if we don't, that's where we're going to stay, right? So we have to celebrate those moments where we're making progress, because that inspires us to continue to make more progress. And I think that's so important in any change movement. And that's the optimism in me too, right? Let's look what are those things that are happening? Like where are the, where I want to see more men coming out on shows like this, talking about the importance of empowering women. I want to see more mentorship programs in work. I want to see, there's so many things I want to see. And it really comes down to organizations doing the right thing for the right reasons. And Sonia, you and I talked about this. Too often organizations don't do it because, quote unquote, they don't need to, or they feel like they don't need to. Everything's fine, right? We're still, whatever business we might be in, revenues are still where they need to be. We're growing how we need to be. It's a short-sighted, it's not the right mindset. It's not the long play. You have to have the long play in mind always. And the long play is rising women in leadership positions in organizations, period. If you're not thinking like that, you're not thinking correctly, and you're going to fail on the long play. I'll make a very bold statement like that. So this slide, I don't know, Sonia, if you want to.
So once we got these characteristics and asked several times to make sure we were getting them right, is we asked another 1,000 U.S. workers to think of a leader who represents the following characteristics. So we chose the top ones that people said were most important. So we said, think of a leader who represents the following characteristics: with integrity, strong, decisive, empathetic, inspiring, patient. Does a picture of a male or female leader come to mind first? And so I would also hope that for our listeners, you maybe took the moment and answered that in your head, as well, as who comes to mind. And we asked this question so many times with different variations, different characteristics in different plays, female, male, in different order, and the answers rotating. And it was 50-50. And that, to us that are sharing this conversation now, was just such a big wow moment. And to Dan's point, and I love the analogy of the flower, is that to me, in some ways, this was pretty shocking, because again, it's not the stats that we're seeing in the workplace, but it is when we're asking people what's most important to someone, that it's half and half. And it could not be more beautiful. I think that outcome in my mind is really encouraging. And it is, it will take time to make those changes. But when people are taking a step back and really thinking about, these are the characteristics I'm looking for in a leader, it does not go towards one gender. It goes actually, again, we asked it so many times, I couldn't believe the actual split, but it always ended up being that way. So Dan, to your point of the progression of the changing mindset of having to be pushing all the time and trying to share different information and encouraging organizations and creating that urgency, this is some kind of, I think, bubbling up of at least people's mindsets really truly changing. And then now it's a matter of, well, how do we concretely make these changes in the organization, right? What can leaders do? What can organizations do? What can HR departments do when they're doing hiring to make sure that we're starting to see this greater representation?
Yeah, it's interesting because given the context of this conversation, right, which is the first female recession, and obviously women have been kind of forced out of the workplace in droves because of the pandemic, this gives me a huge amount of hope that maybe the way we bounce back is through leadership positions, which sounds crazy because there aren't enough for women, right? But if this data is saying that the leaders that are being potentially sought, as as positions become open are leaders that have some of these traits that are warmer, maybe, soft skills. As a culture person, workplace culture person, I'm constantly combating the idea that paying attention to culture is just about soft skills. It's actually, my argument is that culture is all about helping the organization be more successful, and therefore it's about hard skills. It's about ROI. It's about all these things, business goals, things like that. And so it's sort of the opposite argument here, which is interesting, where, the soft skills are now maybe the ones that people will, or organizations will, really look for. And I actually think, I know you guys have all seen the articles about the hordes of people not coming back to the workplace, like resigning from their jobs because they just want something different. There's lots of like pieces to this whole whirlwind going on right now. And if things turn out right, then this kind of leadership example of this data will be the way that we get people back in, but maybe higher up than when they left, which is just an interesting thought. But the data was really strong, like much stronger than I would have thought,
Well, I would love to see even organizations internally maybe asking their employees this kind of question. So that's something that we can make available. To say, okay, so this is the general population. Every organization has a different culture. What do you value in a leader in this organization? Because I think, to me, especially when you're looking to create change, the more you can make it personal, the more impactful it is for those individuals that can make that decision to say, okay, like we really need to step up in an area, or we know we've been talking about diversity, but now is really our chance. And then it's living so much, I think, of this. So to me, I love data, and you both know that. But I've also, as much as possible, been trying to share. I'm not a super open person on social media. I'm still relatively guarded, so I do some of it with caution. But I wrote an article or a post on LinkedIn, I think yesterday, that I'm working from Belgrade. I don't live in Belgrade. I usually live in Buenos Aires. But I was talking about working from anywhere, and this ability to actually the company that I work for told me I could work from anywhere, and I am, and it's incredible. And this is how, it's fulfilling. And so to make those things that we preach in some ways, like the more people that can make it real, I think the faster we can drive that change as well. So just say, hey, here's the data. And then I also send my team, photos of my kid when he falls asleep at the dinner table, and just goofy stuff, again, to humanize all of this, that it's not always, presentations and numbers and how are we doing in our revenue and margins and profitability, but there's so much more to that. So I think it's looking at these statistics, and then each individual, male, female, whatever position you're in, saying, maybe if I haven't felt like I've had the permission to do that before, now I do. Or maybe if I was doing that before, I can step it up. And I would say that, at least for my, personal stories, I've gotten such positive feedback from my team. The more they know me, the more they know the, strong leader, but also the tender mom, the daughter, the spouse, all of those different things. I think the more they enjoy being on the team, because the more real that experience is.
Yeah. Well, you bring up such an interesting point, Sonia. When we talk about data, I think there's this, this idea that data is just financial numbers, these hard numbers, spreadsheets, pivot tables, and then, some outcome mean scores and standard deviations. And it's like, I don't know what this means. But when we talk about, data, if we're capturing it correctly, is about the individual. It's about people. Of course, there's hard financial data. We know that, but there's so much more room to the type of data we need to be capturing. And you all know that I talk about the whole person, and the more data we have, right, that ultimately helps us drive behavior change. And behavior change, the little things you do every day, the changes you decide to make, because the data is helping you understand that and tell you that, whether it's you're using your phone too much. Think about all the data inputs we're getting on a regular basis, but this helps drive behavior change. And behavior change, again, repeatability with behavior change helps to drive and define culture. I mean, culture isn't some big sweeping change that we make. Culture is made up of the small little things that we do every day for each other and for ourselves and for the organization and for the community around us, right? And that's how organizations need to be thinking about this. And so it is, back to that last chart, it is really promising to see, if we think about what makes a great leader, and I'm really happy with the traits that we've been talking about, that right now it's sort of, we're a woman, a man, we all are capable of these characteristics, but now we need to act on it. So I sort of see it, to go back to the flower analogy, the seeds are planted, now we have to take care of them so it grows, right? That means we have to water it. That means we have to make sure the soil is right. That means make sure the sun is shining in the right place. There's a lot of things that need to be done. And so that is an optimistic starting point, but now it's up to leaders, and it's my challenge to organizations: get out there and make sure, right? Make sure you're paying attention to the incredible women in your organization, and make sure there's opportunities, and make sure there are advocates, men and women, who are fighting for make sure that leadership positions are equal, and we have equal pay and equal representation and equal voice and all those things. So it's going to have to happen from the inside, and it's going to take a discipline, and it's going to take a change, and change is not meant to be easy. If it was, it wouldn't be change. Okay? I always say that, like anybody who says, oh, we can change, like, no, it's not that easy. Change takes time. It takes commitment. And so anyway, that's kind of my, that's how I see this data, and this data is promising, and it gives me hope, and I love having hope, especially on a Wednesday, right? Mid-week.
Yeah, I think that's a perfect note to end our show on, because we're just about at time. But yes, thank you, Dan, so much for joining us. And Sonia, do you have any last thoughts?
No, I've really loved this. I think that, we're ending on a positive, optimistic note. I do think organizations have hopefully all the fuel they need to really make a change and really make a difference. And Dan, I could not agree with you more. Change is hard, but the right change is totally worth it. And so, again, what we strive to do here with our brilliant guests is to give organizations ideas for how can you do it. You're not in it alone. But it's worth it. It's worth the fight. And then here are just some ways to approach it. So thank you so much, Dan, for being our guest. Thank you,
pleasure.
Maddie, for all the amazing insights. And I think that's it for today, and definitely looking forward to continuing this conversation over time and continuing to contribute collectively on helping make this change happen.
Well, thank you. And thanks for this forum and bringing us together. This is awesome, fantastic. And thank you, Maddie. Thanks, Sonia. Have a wonderful, wonderful day or evening, wherever you might be.
Wherever in the world you may be. Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks.
Bye.